I want to talk to you about one of the least understood passages in the Bible, the sea and the waves roaring. In the 21st chapter of Luke, the disciples have asked Jesus Christ about the signs of the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. His reply is long, and it gives many signs, some of which related to the siege of Jerusalem by the Romans in the year 70 A.D., which was the direct answer to their question. But some of them also were to be signs of the end of this age and of his second coming. Among these latter were some listed in Luke 21, verse 25, which is an obscure and difficult text, made much more obscure by amazingly bad translation. But one of these signs of the end of the age was the sea and the waves roaring. This has puzzled many earnest Bible readers. Did Jesus really say merely that a storm at sea was to be one of the signs for them to watch for? Thousands of storms at sea, many of them of fearful intensity, have occurred since these words were spoken by Jesus Christ. How would a storm, even a very great storm, be a recognizable sign? And particularly to good, devout Christians who lived hundreds of miles inland and would never even learn that such a storm had occurred. This doesn't seem to make very good sense, does it? And whenever something in the Bible doesn't seem to make sense, it's time to look into it a bit more closely. First, is this a matter of mistranslation? Most of this particular verse is terribly garbled in your King James Version Bible. But this one part of it, the sea and the waves roaring, is confirmed as correct by good translations. Then, if the wording is correct and doesn't mean much when taken literally, we know it must be symbolic. We may be sure that Jesus Christ never bothered to speak trifles, so there is here some symbolism which is worth our further study. Unfortunately, many preachers try to spiritualize the Bible into utter nonsense, trying to make almost every word symbolic and getting the most fantastic meanings for their symbolic values, sometimes reaching these silly conclusions out of their own weird notions, sometimes taking them from Hindu, Tibetan, Egyptian, or other pagan sources. In this, of course, they are invariably wrong. Whenever the Bible uses symbolism, it makes it clear that the words are not meant literally, as we've seen in the case we're now discussing. And the Bible always supplies the key to its own symbolism, and no other source will ever give you the right answer. So, since we have here a symbolic statement that one of the signs of the end of this age will be the sea and the waves roaring, let's see what the Bible itself tells us is the meaning of this symbol. We find many places in the Bible where the sea or waters or occasionally a river is used symbolically. If this use proves to have a consistent meaning in these many places, then we can be sure that the sea and the waves roaring will have the same meaning. The simplest use of such terms we find in the Psalms. In Psalm 18, verses 16 and 17, it says, "He sent from above, he took me, he drew me out of many waters. He delivered me from my strong enemy, and from them which hated me, for they were too strong for me." Again in Psalm 69, verse 14, "Deliver me out of the mire, and let me not sink. Let me be delivered from them that hate me, and out of the deep waters." Now it's very clear that King David, living and writing in a desert land, was not worried about drowning in deep waters. He makes it very plain that he likens being overwhelmed by his enemies, who were people, to sinking into deep waters. The language is obviously symbolic, and it's used consistently. But this is also used on a greater scale, where the power of a great army overrunning a land is symbolized by a river and flood. In Isaiah 8, verse 7, which refers to the coming invasion of Israel, we read, "Now therefore, behold, the Lord brings up upon them the waters of the river, strong and many, even the king of Assyria and all his glory. And he shall come up over all his channels, and go over all his banks." The symbolic use is clear, and the key to the meaning of the symbol is even given in the very same verse. Again, we find waters used symbolically to represent people, but this time people in large numbers, as a nation or an army. We find another example of this in Isaiah 43, verse 2. When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee. When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee. Now Isaiah was here speaking prophetically to the people of the 10-tribe northern kingdom of Israel, who had just been taken into captivity by the great empire of Assyria. They were being deported across the entire width of the great Assyrian Empire to be resettled in a large area around the southern end of the Caspian Sea. And again, notice the consistency of the symbol. In Isaiah 8, verse 7, the prophet had spoken of the king of Assyria and his army as a river which would overflow its banks and flood the land, which it did when the kingdom of Israel was overrun and conquered. But now he assures Israel that God will be with them when they pass through the waters, and will not let the river completely overflow them in their deportation and resettlement in their new home in Scythia. Assyria would not be allowed to destroy them. And Isaiah here had even more in view, to occur centuries later. As the people of Israel, who by that later time were known by new names, Scythians, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Angli, and Saxones, as they started on their long march toward their predestined new European homelands, then out of Asia came a vast flood of people, the Huns, under Attila. They tried to move swiftly enough to cross Israel's path and cut them off, but God would not allow this invasion to come until the Israel tribes had safely crossed into northern Europe, and the Huns could only bark and snap at the heels of Israel's rear guard. This river, this vast army of the Huns, was not allowed to overflow them, exactly as God had promised. And again we find the use of the terms waters and river symbolically used to mean people consistently. This is not the only such prophecy of this particular event in the Bible. True to its own law of the need for at least 2 witnesses to prove a point, the Bible gives another reference to it, written by a different prophet. In the book of Revelation, chapter 12, the Apostle John is given a prophetic vision of the same event. In this chapter, John saw a woman who was obviously symbolic of Israel, and who gave birth to a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and who was caught up to God and to his throne, this being Jesus Christ, of course. Then the serpent, Satan, persecuted the woman, the Israel nation, and God gave her 2 wings of a great eagle with which to flee into the wilderness. And you note that those parts of Europe into which the people of Israel migrated were at that time a wilderness. Then the book of Revelation goes on, and the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after her, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But it says that the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. And so it was. The mighty hordes of the Huns rolled across most of Europe, but they came south of the lands into which Israel had migrated. And on the death of Attila in the year A.D. 453, his vast army broke up in disorder and melted away in retreat back to Asia. And again, note that in this prophecy, John also uses a flood of water as a symbol for a vast army sweeping through the land like a devastating flood. But much was to happen in the meantime, so Zechariah covers this. There were 2 huge and mighty empires then in great power, yet they must crumble into ruin as God willed. One was Assyria, the other was Egypt. So Zechariah 10, verse 11 prophesies, "And he shall pass through the sea with affliction, and shall smite the waves in the sea, and all the deeps of the rivers shall dry up. And the pride of Assyria shall be brought down, and the scepter of Egypt shall depart away. Now, we have no record of any disturbances of the real sea and rivers, but the symbolic sea of Assyria's vast armies was smitten, and its proud empire was brought down, totally destroyed. Likewise, Egypt, which is so often symbolized by its great river Nile, suffered the prophesied fate. The scepter of Egypt shall depart away. It was but very little later that Egypt lost its independence and became the vassal state under one great power after another. And again, note how the symbolism here is consistent. The sea, the waves, the river, floods, great waters, all these are consistently used as the symbols for peoples, nations, and races. Surely you shouldn't be surprised at this, for God is always consistent because He's always truthful, and the truth must necessarily be consistent with itself. In Jeremiah 51, verse 42, the prophet foretold the coming fall of Babylon, for he said this, "The sea is come up upon Babylon. She is covered with the multitude of the waves thereof." Now we know that Babylon was hundreds of miles inland, and not in the slightest danger from a sea of water. So this definitely prophesies the invasion and conquest by the great armies of Media and Persia, which occurred about 60 years after Jeremiah wrote this. And again, note the consistent use of the symbol. Now the prophet Isaiah was looking ahead 26 centuries to our own times when he wrote in Isaiah 17, verses 12 and 13, "Woe to the multitude of many people, which make a noise like the noise of the seas, and to the rushing of nations that make a rushing like the rushing of mighty waters. The nations shall rush like the rushing of many waters, but God shall rebuke them, and they shall flee far off, and shall be chased as the chaff of the mountains before the winds, and like a tumbleweed before the whirlwind." We see today the evil gathering of all the dark peoples of the earth, joined together in the hope of crushing and plundering the white race, who are the only productive peoples in the earth. But in truth they are gathering only for their own destruction, for God will thwart their evil plans. We find mention of this evil mobilization in the book of Revelation, chapter 13, verse 1. "And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the names of blasphemy." This last bestial empire rises out of the sea of the great hordes of Asia and Africa. And again in Revelation 17, verses 1 and 15, we read, "And there came one of the 7 angels which had the 7 vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sits upon many waters. And he said unto me, The waters which thou sawest, where the whore sitteth, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues." Therefore, when Jesus Christ used the symbol of the sea and the waves roaring, he was speaking of an uproar of nations and races. Indeed, the Psalms also tell us of this same thing. Psalm 2, verses 1 to 3 says, "Why do the heathen rage, and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, Let us break their bands asunder, and cast away their cords from us." This is exactly what we have seen since the end of World War II. The uncivilized races of Asia and Africa have demanded independence, and by the corrupt connivance of sinister politicians, they have been given it. We see the result today in the senseless massacres by the Negroes of not only the whites, but even of their fellow savages in the Congo, Zanzibar, Tanganyika, Kenya, Rwanda, and Urundi, where the Negroes are behaving like Negroes. The only trace of civilization they ever saw was what the white man brought them, and that is vanishing now as the white man is being driven out. But these untamed cannibals had been artificially grouped into so-called nations, which they never were, for their newly made national boundaries include many separate tribes bitterly hostile to each other. Doing this had only one real purpose: to make these artificial nations out of these cannibals, so that their votes in the United Nations would outvote the entire civilized world, and pull all the world down into that destruction out of which only the bold thieves and murderers can profit. But this is not news to God. Psalm 83, verses 1 to 4 tells it. Keep not thou silence, O God. Hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God. For lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people, and consulted against thy hidden ones. They have said, Come, and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. And so indeed they have done. And traitors within our own nation, hoping to profit by getting greater power in the tyranny which will be set up on the ruins of our once free republic, they are indeed trying to cut us off from being a nation, trying to put us completely under the rule of a United Nations world government in which we would have only one vote, and indeed the entire civilized world would only have some 12 to 15 votes, against nearly 100 votes of the enemies who wait in greedy impatience for the moment when they can enslave and plunder us. But God himself will upset their plots. We find this again in Psalm 46, verses 1 to 3. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore will we not fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though the waters thereof roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with the swelling thereof. We know that the word mountain is often used as the symbol of a kingdom, an organized nation. How many times in this generation we've seen a mountain or organized government shaken and finally carried into the midst of the sea, or dissolved in revolution by a sea of turbulent people. In this manner, one after another of the peaceful governments which were friendly to us have disappeared, and they've been replaced by left-wing or even openly communist governments which group together to spout against us their hatred and their threats, and before whom our government has shamefully cringed, trying to placate them by timid retreat. But this show of fear doesn't appease them. It only inflames their hate and enlarges their demands against us. So this is the sign of which Jesus Christ spoke, the sea and the waves roaring. It is surely a sign of the end of the age we have known, because if it is allowed to increase, all civilization will be blotted out in the new dark ages. But God has promised that we can trust him to save us, although we certainly can't trust our politicians. The great alliance of all the dark world against us will march, not to our destruction, but to their own. The 46th Psalm, verses 6 to 9, completes the picture. The heathen raged, the kingdoms were moved, but he uttered his voice, and the earth melted. The Lord of hosts is with us, the God of Jacob is our refuge. Come, behold the works of the Lord, what desolations he has made in the earth. He makes war to cease unto the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and cuts the spear in sunder. He burns the chariot in the fire. The evil tumult of the uncivilized nations against us is a bad thing, one which our leaders would never have allowed to happen if they had been true to their trust. But it is here, and its presence is a sign not only of the trouble we've gotten ourselves into, but also of the rapid approach of the end of this age. Psalm 65, verses 5 to 7 reassures us. By terrible things in righteousness wilt thou answer us, O God of our salvation, who art the confidence of all the ends of the earth, and of them that are afar off upon the sea. which by his strength sets fast the mountains, being girded with power, which stills the noise of the seas, the noise of the waves, and the tumult of the people. Rejoice then that you have seen this sign of the sea and the waves roaring. While it is evil and threatens death and destruction in itself, yet it is also a sign that the return of our Redeemer, Jesus Christ, is near. The end of this poor age, yes, but the beginning of the kingdom of God in full power upon the earth, with Jesus Christ upon the throne, as King of kings and Lord of lords forever.